Global and Canadian efforts to combat the COVID-19 pandemic rely on rapid innovations in healthcare. This panel will address how unprecedented collaboration and information transparency are enabling healthcare innovation from multiple angles, including vaccine development, and how healthcare systems are adapting to provide the best care possible. Please welcome moderator Richard Gold from McGill University, and panelists Gary Kobinger from Université Laval, Srinivas Murthy from BC's Children's Hospital, Tal Zaks from Moderna, and Erica E.M. Moody from McGill University.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Welcome to my co-panelists who were briefly introduced. We are live from across North America, across Canada and the United States, sitting on territory originally inhabited by various Indigenous peoples, and I'd like to acknowledge that. And on this Remembrance Day in particular, want to acknowledge the great contributions that our Indigenous peoples did during wartime effort. My name is Richard Gold, as already mentioned, and I am the moderator for this panel. I'm a James McGill professor at McGill in law and in medicine. I'm joined today, as you know, by Dr. Gary Kobinger. If you want to raise your, I don't know if you can see him. He's the director of the Research Center of Infectious Diseases at Laval and a member of the WHO Strategic and Technical Advisory Group for Infectious Hazards. Dr. Erica Moody, this is in alphabetical order, is a professor of biostatistics and William Dawson Scholar at McGill University, and she'll be talking about the COVID vaccine tracker, which she has helped work on. Dr. Srinivas Murthy is Canada Research Chair in Pandemic Preparedness Research at UBC and co-chair of the WHO Clinical Research Theme. Dr. Tal Zaks is the Chief Medical Officer at Moderna, and we're expecting a big announcement probably from you guys in the next couple of weeks, and one of the people at a firm that is going to help us get out of this, I hope. Over the last few decades, we have seen that the biopharmaceutical industry has suffered increase in costs. It's both to the companies themselves, but also to consumers, and fairly static business models involved with siloing research, not sharing. But at the very beginning of COVID, we saw a big change. People started exchanging knowledge quite freely, and this accelerated the pace of research. Things that we thought were impossible before COVID, that companies wouldn't share, that we couldn't actually build up public knowledge, suddenly were put in doubt. And we have proven through various efforts that working together often has benefits that others don't. I myself am working in a group called VIMI, V-I-M-I, which is well named for today's date, which is Viral Interruption Medicines Initiative. You can find us at vimiopen.org. And we're doing open drug research, building on open science models involving major industry players, but also researchers and so on, particularly in areas around the pandemic and AMR, pediatric diseases. So I'm really interested in how we use the power of open science to accelerate research, provide incentives to industry to take that knowledge and turn it into products that they bring to market, how we can track how the pandemic is being, how drugs are being delivered and the repercussions of that. And so I'm really excited that all of you have agreed to speak today. The way we're going to work is we're going to talk for about 20 minutes. I'll be asking each panelist in turn a series of questions and then open it up to you out there to engage the panelists with questions or with topics of particular interest. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Murthy, and I want you to take a broad look at what's going on here. From a public health perspective, what information do we really need to share so that we can respond to the pandemic, drawing on what's happened and what you think is, where are the critical areas of shared knowledge that you can identify?
Well, that's a packed question. That's a lot of things there. I want to draw the first line, I guess, since this is an open science symposium, on the difference between public health information and scientific information. Obviously, public health officials use scientific data, scientists use public health data, but the sources will differ. Obviously, the latter, like with clinical trials, comes with consent or protections of IRBs. The former, public health data, does not, and so the distinction between the two is crucial when you're determining, say, use cases. From a public health perspective, and so wearing my public health hat, I think an important point, and if you look at the world right now, an effective public health response is predicated on communities buying into policy recommendations. And that buy-in is built on trust. And so regions with effective public health responses have been regions where trust has been highest, sometimes deserved, sometimes less so. And obviously, I'm not a political scientist. I'm not going to get into the specifics of how that trust is built. But as we think about open data and open sharing from a public health perspective, trust has to be earned to share that data in a transparent and good faith way. And I think places that have shared the data, some places have done it quite well with open data from a public health perspective, some places less so. Say by labeling individual communities or individual households as being targets of super spreader events, and then stigmatizing individuals accordingly. And so I think there's lines that can be drawn as to where open data is useful from a public health perspective, and open data needs to be thought about very carefully. And a lot of that is going to be contextual, and a lot of that's going to be driven by local norms. I always think about the differences between the Chinese response and the United States response. And once again, I'm not a politician, I'm not a political scientist. But the latter, the US tends to have more transparent data sharing as it relates to public health information. But sometimes it's not used always in good faith, and some misinformation gets out there. The alternative, say the China model, for example, where not all data was readily shared globally, but the public health response, arguably, was very effective if you look at the number of total cases and deaths. And so I think it's a complicated world out there from a public health perspective as to what data can be shared and not shared. Scientifically...
Oui, j'ai perdu mon ordinateur. C'est pas qui t'a appelé. C'est qui? Ah, je sais pas comment ça que... Peut-être Marie essaie de t'appeler puis mes écouteurs ont embarqué.
Dr. Murthy, just continue.
Sorry. So scientifically, from a clinical perspective, if you think about what sort of data needs to be shared from an open perspective, it would be wonderful if every COVID case in the world was tracked with a minimal data set, and we knew exactly what the side effects were and what the long-term effects were. Obviously, there's a ton of challenges in getting there in terms of data sharing across borders, across institutions, and the consent models built in. And I think that's something that could be worked on moving forward as we learn what to do with this disease.
In just like a minute or so, are there particular successes that you can point out where we did really well in sharing?
Obviously, everyone's going to point to the sequence being shared fairly rapidly back in January. That's driven a lot of the science going forward, and we'll talk about much of that later today. I think a lot of the clinical trial information has been a success thus far, and namely protocols being shared, collaborating across interventions, everything being registered in a very clear way. I think that can be pointed to as a success. Obviously, individual patient data would be better served by more sharing, but that has complexities that are beyond the scope of what we have time to talk about right now.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to you, Dr. Zaks, if I can. So we talked about openness, but obviously from a firm perspective, a line has to be drawn at some point between your proprietary product that you put on the market and the openness. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about where you see that line, either generally or in the case of Moderna. You drew on the public knowledge. At what point do we then turn private in order to get the incentive to get a product out there?
So I think the answer is going to be slightly different when we're talking about a pandemic versus, business as usual, if you will. And let me expand on that. In the pandemic context, there's a sense of urgency, and that sense of urgency breeds a need for trust. And we spoke about trust here. And I think when we were getting started, it was crystal clear to me that the most important tool we have as a pharmaceutical company to bring people along with the journey of what we're doing is transparency. And so when we launched the phase 3 trial, we were very explicit. I remember on an open call being very detailed about all the statistical analysis plan and everything that goes with it, because I thought that would give people an understanding of, okay, if you see my statistical analysis plan and I see our resident statistician smiling, you should know what the trial is about, right? Well, then I see an interview that Eric Topol was talking to Paul Offit. Paul Offit is one of the preeminent voices of vaccines in the United States. And Eric is asking him, so what do you think about Moderna's vaccine? And Paul says, well, I think it's okay, but I'm not sure. I haven't seen their protocol. And it really made me think, well, I've given you everything that's relevant, so why not just show you the entire protocol? And we had a lot of internal debate, and finally, I'm glad we prevailed because, being up front and being the first one, we had the opportunity to set a different bar. And so we went and posted our entire protocol, no redaction, on the web. And I'm happy to say within 72 hours, all the other large pharma players followed suit. And one very important thing ensued, which is the public dialogue then stopped to be about, oh, I'm not sure what they're doing. And it started to be about, explain to me the difference between your interim analysis and your final analysis. Okay, now we have an opportunity to talk about the stuff that matters. And so for me, the big learning was the more transparent you are, the more relevant the dialogue is to the content as opposed to the trust. And so we followed suit since then. We've put a consent form. People ask, well, what's your consent form? So we published that. Then people said, well, what about the totality of data? Because a manuscript only gives you part of it. Well, we put the totality of our phase 1 data as we understand them, again, on the web. So in a way, I think this has been an opportunity for us to set a different bar. Now, 2 other points I think are worth making. First, for me, and this is important, this is a pandemic and it's a different setting. And I've said time and again, while we were the first out there, that my only 2 competitors are the virus and the clock, in the sense that the world needs every pharma to succeed here. And the more the merrier, because no one company can do this. Now, I'm proud of the fact that we're on the leading edge and hope to see results soon. We've seen recently results from one of the other companies that have a very similar platform. So I'm very optimistic, but I'm hopeful for everybody else that they get there as well. And the final point that I think is worth mentioning is, we're supported by taxpayer money. So I think that puts another level of obligation in terms of the sense of competition. So between those last 2 points about this not being the time to be competitive and public support, I think the typical rules of the game don't apply. Now, that being said, if I have one hope, it's that a lot of what we learn under the time frame of a pandemic will actually serve us well for the future. I mean, the sharing of scientific papers, right, in bioarchives before they ever get published, the peer-reviewed community was sure the sky would fall in. Well, it didn't. Actually, I would argue you've got a different level of peer review that happens these days by virtue of the preprint servers. We've certainly been beneficiaries of that. People mentioned the sequence. We were able to start production of our vaccine within 48 hours of the sequence being available because of the prior scientific knowledge that was for SARS and an understanding of what the antigen is. And it's not just about open communication in terms of putting papers out there. You mentioned collaboration. I think that's a critical part of the puzzle. It certainly has been for us. We've been working with the NIH for years trying to demonstrate that our platform is indeed the right type of response platform. And so we were very well primed in the beginning of January to pick up the phone, talk to the folks at the NIH and figure out how do we chase this thing together. And that led to a wonderful collaboration. In fact, the phase 1 data was generated by the NIH on our vaccine they had the resources and capabilities to both run the study and set up the assays. We ran the phase 2, and we came back to run together the phase 3, which is now fully enrolled. So that's an example for me of a phenomenal collaboration that happened under really, really stressful circumstances, and yet everybody kind of did their part, and everybody showed up with the thing that they're best at to enable the development of this vaccine.
That's great. In terms of the industry as a whole, and not just Moderna, are there one or two things that you found particularly successful? You gave the example of putting out your protocols and changing the dialogue, but is there anything else that you could point to as being really successful about openness and the open sharing?
I think there are two elements that are relevant here. I think one has been the rapid standing up of the assays. Remember, we can do trials all day long, but in phase 1 and phase 2, you're reliant on the assays to know what it is you're doing. And so the ability of people to share reagents and share assays and collaborate in, what's a neutralizing antibody titer? Well, that depends on the lab that sets it up. So the collaboration in that sphere between the companies and, more importantly, academic centers and the company, I think, has been critical and will continue to be critical as we think about vaccines that will come later that will have to demonstrate their utility based on surrogate markers, because hopefully we'll be in a world where you're not going to need to run any more randomized trials. And then there have been other subtle elements that I think are as important. If you look at the protocol designs, the fact that there was ongoing dialogue between the companies and FDA in the US on the endpoints, I think puts us in a good place to be able to compare amongst the different candidates when the data are out. So if you look at the public discourse on the endpoints in these trials, they're really quibbling over the, is oxygen saturation 93 or 92? Well, the fact of the matter is we're measuring oxygen saturation, all of us are, and that's going to be a marker of severe disease. So the commonalities, I think, will enable us as a community to learn and draw a much firmer conclusion than if everybody was doing their own protocol to their own endpoints, sort of in their own little box, and only then coming out with the results.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to Dr. Kobinger. And I want to talk more specifically about vaccines, but one thing that we haven't talked about yet is validating vaccines and the sharing of information to validate and compare and make sure they're of high quality. And I'm wondering if you can comment on what kind of information do we need to do that? Are we getting that information?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the issue here, and to answer your question, I mean, mine is the vaccine first safe and second protective? You can see that people are such in the demand of a vaccine that we get the CEO to announce that they have 90% efficacy and nobody is asking for the safety data. I think, of course, it's just an interim analysis, but these are the main two aspects, safety first and efficacy second, especially first, that it's very serious, it's bringing the world economy down, but it's still less than 1% of case fatality rate. So with billions of people, potentially being vaccinated in the next year or two, safety will certainly be a very important aspect. It has not been shared very well. I'm glad to have somebody from Moderna on this panel like this. I can be a bit more precise and they can answer. But they had one patient, a participant, spending some emergency room because of side effect. We haven't seen much of that. There is 8 other participants of different clinical trials that were hospitalized, and we haven't seen a lot of those data. So I think that, the bottom line of safety and potency is not fully addressed, in my view. This is what really matters. I agree that, we can we want about a specific neutralizing or not. At the end, this is not so much what matters here. What matters is to protect people, and protecting them is also in terms of safety following vaccination. But I will touch 2 additional points that I think are very important that you mentioned. One that is using this open science, open knowledge to help companies or commercial interests I will challenge that. The open science is paid by taxpayers, and I think the goal is to get them the best for their money. And I'm glad also that it's very rarely acknowledged that a lot of the development currently is paid by taxpayer dollars, including to companies. And I hope that when they start rolling out vaccine, and I let me tell you, I really hope that the RNA is going to work based vaccine, because it's a terrific technology to respond rapidly. They were so fast to respond rapidly to an emerging pathogen. But at the same time, I think that as people are paying for it, the development, the science, what they sit on, I think, they need to see what are the profit margin, what is the benefit for society to invest in research and development, and then for company to build on and develop great product at the end. The Canadian healthcare system is a universal access. It's not free. It costs a lot of money, but it doesn't make profit. So again, nothing against for-profit company, but when we see profit margin of 10,000% to save people's life, then I have to say that transparency is missing at a lot of steps. Thank you.
So just to follow up, what lessons can we take? Because as you said, the pandemic is a different situation. All of you have been saying that so far. The enemy is time and the virus. And so there's a lot of engagement with openness, particularly on the early phases. I agree with you on the latter phases less. But as we move back to hopefully regular life and regular drug development, what sharing do you think is going to be essential going forward?
You're asking me, or?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Well, again, I think it's, I think that everything that is being done is improving, honestly. I think it's great to see Moderna, as an example, sharing their clinical protocol, sharing the stat analysis, sharing as they are being asked. At least they are sharing the information, acknowledging the public investment in their technology. So I think this is great. But I think as we move forward, I don't know that it should be the CEO of a company disclosing potency of a vaccine without showing any of the detail data. And maybe that was not the right time. I don't know. But we need to see also the safety of these studies. We need to see more detail. We need to see how, including how governments select one platform more than the other one. At the end, it's trust towards vaccination, and this is a very important moment in the history of vaccine development. We have never seen so much work on vaccine development of new platform and new technologies. We are now rewriting the development of vaccine tools that will be available for generations to come, and at the same time, we need to put all the information out. We need to make sure that if there's a step or 10 steps forward and one backwards, we need to understand all the steps, because people cannot lose trust in vaccination. It cannot happen. It's so important, the number of lives that have been saved through vaccination. So again, I think there's some work to do, but it's definitely, considering, as you said, that we are in the middle of an outbreak, an epidemic that is devastating. I think it's, we're trying to get everything done at the same time. So it's challenging, definitely.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to you, Dr. Murthy, and maybe you could first just tell us, what is the COVID vaccine tracker? What does it do? What kind of information are you sharing?
Certainly. So our website, which is at trackvaccines.org, is following the 53 COVID-19 specific vaccines that are currently being investigated in 126 clinical trials in humans in 35 different countries. And on our website, you can look at the map that's on a home page. It's a global map, and you can click on a given country to see how many trials are underway in each country and what phases they're in. So the countries are color-coded by the highest phase of ongoing trials in that country. We also have a sort of card-based system where you can learn about specific vaccines, see again what phase of trial they're in and where those trials are taking place, and the technology being used to develop the vaccine. We also have a small FAQ section where visitors can submit questions and explaining how vaccines work. So really our aim is to bring all of the information that we can about progress to a vaccine for COVID-19 to the general public. So one of the things that the previous speakers have mentioned is this idea of openness, that we are publishing more protocols and that there is more information available. And while that's true, I think not all of that information is accessible to the general public. So it's very good for scientists, but we also need, as Dr. Murthy was saying, that trust from the general public. We need trust in vaccines, we need trust in scientists. And so making this information open, not just among scientists, but to the general public was really our goal, to do this with a global view.
In terms of where do you get the data? Where's the information? Is it coming directly from companies or are you culling it from somewhere?
So our site is made possible by two things. One is the openness of the data. Most of our data, I would say the vast majority, comes from WHO reports, but we are also getting it from several different academic sites, other trackers which are focusing on a slightly different subset of trials in some cases, as well as clinical trial registries. And the second thing that makes it possible is that we have a really large and energetic team of epidemiologists, statisticians, computer scientists, and public health practitioners. We have 18 people working on this. So initially this was meant as almost a side project. We thought it would be interesting and important. It was conceived by my colleague Nicole Basta. But the truth is that although the data, as I said, are accessible and available publicly, they're not always available in ways that are easy to access. The WHO, for example, publishes its reports in a PDF format that changes every few weeks. So it's not easy, for all the power of AI we have, it's not possible to automate this process. It really requires a lot of manual checking. The clinical trials protocols can change over time. So again, even once we have put that information in place, it requires weekly checking. And some things are simply not easily available in any of these places. And so we're also scanning public media to try to find out about things like early approvals in different countries. So there's an awful lot of manual work that has to take place.
So in 30 seconds or less, what are one or two pieces of data and who should be giving them to you that would really be helpful?
Oh, my dream world would be just more standardized forms. So even in the clinical trials registry where there's, specific things that each trial needs to fill out, they're filled out in slightly different ways, which makes automation really difficult. And so while I always struggle with the idea of too much AI, this is a case where it would be really nice if we could automate a little bit more by just having much more standardized forms that are fillable and common across different countries.
That's great. Okay, I think we're going to move to the audience input, and you'll be able to respond, I hope, to each other through that. So now I'm turning to the audience and asking for your help in leading to the next step of this conversation. So you can do so by typing in your questions into the chat, and they'll come up. I see one is already there. The other way to engage is to vote on the topics included in the description of the panel. If you would like to hear more about the listed topics, we'll see them rise, and we can put some more questions to the panelists. So for example, if you're interested in hearing more about the role of international organizations such as the WHO in encouraging information sharing, you would type in the number 2 in the chat box. So I see questions going, and so people are, rather than typing in questions, they're doing topics. So far, the importance of collaborations between industry and public organizations. Dr. I think Zach's had touched on that. Does anybody else want to talk? Maybe I'll go back to Dr. Murthy about the importance of collaboration between industry and public organizations.
Yeah, clearly industry has a fundamental and important role to play. Speaking to Dr. Kobinger's points earlier about how that interrelationship between public funds and industry engagement happens. I think transparency in those processes is going to be very important, both in terms of how decisions are made and what sort of the cost benefit to our larger system is. Like Dr. Kobinger said, Canada is a single payer system. And so those decisions are important for everyone to appreciate for that trust component. And I always go back to that whenever I talk about anything pandemic related, because any response, be it vaccine, be it science, be it clinical trials, be it consent, be it public health data sharing, it's built on trust. And really focusing on those relationships between policymakers and the population is fundamental.
Dr. Kobinger, do you want to continue on with that discussion, that point?
Listen, I fully agree. I cannot agree more. I don't want to repeat the same thing. I'll just add this because I don't want to come out as somebody that is against industry. It's not absolutely not that. I have a lot of friends in the industry and they are much more efficient than a lot of other, let's say, structure, and they basically save money. But again, it's a matter of transparency. It's a matter of, how do we do those investments? How do we end up paying for the end of it? Because at the extreme, it will not be correct that the industry pays for the research and development, including basic, and all the way to a product, and it's not happening. But it will not also be correct that taxpayer dollars are paying for the fundamental research, applied research, clinical trials, and even late-stage clinical development that is like it's happening now. Not entirely, but in large part. And so it's just a matter of again having a good relationship, transparency, and so that it's based on trust, and we keep the trust very high. Thank you.
Okay. Just a reminder to the audience, please type in your questions or rank topics. I want to go back to information sharing, and perhaps go back to you, Dr. Zex, about, you heard Dr. Murthy talk about the kinds of things she needs. Do you have other ideas about how we can increase the quality of the data sharing? And both Dr. Murthy and Dr. Kobinger talked about the data on the validation side, about you guys have not yet released it, so we don't know what it's going to look like, but how you're thinking about releasing that data and the kinds of data we can expect.
So a few thoughts. We have been very transparent, even as the trial was ongoing, in terms of our enrollment curves, et cetera, and not just the protocol. The reality is, though, it is impractical. We're not the ones that can set a standard, right? A company, as was mentioned before, there's a certain operational efficiency that we need to have in order to be able to do our job. And when it comes to data structures, FDA has standardized them, regulators have standardized them. And at the end of the day, when the data are available, then we will make public as much as is feasible to make public. As I've indicated, we've already gone beyond what is typically considered normal in terms of sharing the granular information. To the point of safety and efficacy, I fully agree that one must look at both, and we do and we will. But I think we also need to understand that companies operate within a certain context of public scrutiny and public investment. And the reason the CEO, was out with the top line results is because he's got a fiduciary duty to his stakeholders to tell them what's new. And he cannot wait for academic opinions to be formed on the totality of the data before he goes out with something that is so material to their stakeholders. That's just the reality of the construct in which we operate. And so on one hand, he was being over transparent. On the other hand, he's never transparent enough because it's not the totality of the data that academics have weighed in. Well, that takes time. And so you got to find a balance somewhere. And we struggle with it, have always struggled with it, because it is a balancing act of appeasing the different stakeholders. I will say this in terms of cost of investment, let's be clear. The U.S. government has played a big role in developing our vaccine, that money is spoken for in the price of our vaccine at the end of the day. And the price of our vaccine, as I understand it, is less than the price of a diagnostic test. When you look at when all is said and done, the difference being that you're only going to need 2 doses of the vaccine, whereas you need the diagnostic test every time you're worried you may get infected. So I have no problem whatsoever defending the fact that the value that our vaccine is bringing at the price points that are being discussed, the vast majority of that value is captured back by society, whether it's the US society that actually put their dime on it, or whether it's the global world that will end up benefiting from it. And the final point I'd say is we've been very clear that from an IP perspective, and remember, people have been investing billions of their own private capital for a decade just so that the government can show up and have the opportunity to have a vaccine at the end of the day. And we've said that we will not prosecute our intellectual property during the time of a pandemic just because we respect the fact that these are different circumstances. So we're doing everything that we can within, I think, a fair and balanced construct of the world in which we operate to enable collaboration between all the relevant parties and to make sure that society captures the majority of the value of these vaccines and we can all get our life back to normal once there are vaccines available. Over.
Yeah. Thank you. If I can indulge, you talked about your price point being lower than otherwise would be because you got upfront money. You also have procurement contracts, which set out that price. And when we're trying to provide incentives to firms to share and to participate, the government has various tools, and you mentioned two of those. How important is procurement? Because we haven't really talked about that. The fact that you had these procurement contracts in place to allow you to invest and to share.
Look, I think within the construct of the United States, the U.S. government was trying to help the sponsors that they see in the lead procure the instruments they need in order to finalize the manufacturing that has to do mostly with fill finish, et cetera. So I think that's important, but it's important primarily in terms of achieving the combined goal of ensuring that there's enough vaccine available at the end. It is not an economic driver, if you will. It is more to ensure that the U.S. And eventually the world have enough supplies available during this pandemic. That's where I see the major contribution of the collaboration we and others have had with Operation Warp Speed.
Maybe go to Dr. Moody. Who is using your tracker? Is it mostly, do you know who it is? I mean, you said it's aimed at the general public, but do you know if it's academics? Is it the rich countries? Are people in developing countries also using it? Are policymakers using it?
I can't speak to who is using it, but I can speak to where it's being accessed. So we're getting a little over 20,000 hits a week. And the top countries are Canada and the US, but we're also seeing a high proportion of visitors from India, Mexico, several of the European countries, so France, Italy, and Germany. We've seen users in Indonesia and in Bangladesh. So it's clear there's a real global appetite for understanding the progress and understanding what's going on both locally and globally.
Are we providing enough information so that developing countries are being able to make decisions in terms of where to put their more limited resources into fighting this pandemic and the types of vaccines and start to plan out? Staying with you, Dr. Moody.
I'm a little out of my depth on this one in that what we are certainly providing the information of what trials are happening in what countries, but the approval processes are very different from country to country. So just because a vaccine goes through its phase 3 trials in one country doesn't guarantee that it would be approved in another country. The same vaccine, the same platform might be developed in 2 different sites and therefore need to go through phase 3 trials based on the second producer. So it's very difficult to know exactly how each country would be taking and using that information because it's very context specific. So I would hope so, but it's hard for me to speak really generally. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Maybe I'll turn to you, Dr. Murthy, if you've got some ideas about what's going on in developing countries. Most of what we generally see in Canada, United States, is what's happening in Europe and so on. But in terms of getting this vaccine out and available, because if we don't solve it everywhere, we don't solve it anywhere. So how do we use this information? Are they getting the information they need?
So, like, whether they're getting the information they need is a sort of a complicated question that I'm not privy to answer. In terms of whether they will get the vaccine and can make thoughtful decisions, and I think there's a lot of reliance on global bodies to help with that process. And so I'm sure people on this call know about CEPI and COVAX and how those institutions are organized as to how they are funding vaccine candidates and how they are ultimately hoping to allocate vaccines to lower income regions of the world. Their approval process will still be at the country level, obviously, because each country has their own infrastructure for approval. But I think some countries have more capacity than others to do those regulatory oversights. And so there will be reliance on those central structures, such as the WHO. And I think more than ever, strengthening the WHO with money and trust, once again, is super crucial at this point in time.
That's a wonderful place, I think, to end our conversation. We could have gone on a lot longer. Thank you to the audience for voting on the topics, but especially thank you to our panelists, Dr. Kobinger, Dr. Moody, Dr. Murthy, and Dr. Zaks. This was very informative. I hope we all stay engaged with open science and even post-pandemic, and just want to thank you all.